One of the most common questions I keep seeing online is, does anybody know what happens in a flight test? What sort of questions the examiner asks? Has anybody got some tips? Well, today's your lucky day. I'm going to start off with the RPL flight test, and in today's episode, we're going to mainly focus on what the test is all about and how to prepare for the ground component. I've got all that and more coming right up, so strap in and let's get into it.
Good morning, 3614, Alpha Mallow 7 PAB with altitude.
Coordinating, Halo, I'm running bank, talent, bank pressure rolling at 30 degrees. That's 30 degrees there. Simbo star 9000, 1013, K5 25.
G'day everyone and welcome to episode 202 of the Flight Training Australia podcast. The podcast all about flight training and flying in Australia and beyond. G'day, my name's Trent Robinson, I'm your host, and a very warm welcome to you all. For those that are just joining or new to the podcast, haven't seen or heard much about it, my name's Trent Robinson. I'm a flight examiner up in Darwin and a flight instructor, check and trainer, and also occasionally some charter flying, depending on what I'm doing each day, each week. And having an absolute ball. And this podcast is very much put together with a lot of that experience in mind, talking to others in industry and sharing information to help you in your career and the progress of whatever it is you're doing, whether you're doing a flight test now or preparing for a new rating and endorsement, getting a new job, doing a proficiency check, or just want to talk about aviation in general. It's all here, and it's fantastic to have you all again listening to this episode. If you aren't already, make sure you jump on your favorite podcast player. You can subscribe to the channel. It's on YouTube as well. You can hit the notification bell so you get the notifications. They typically come out every Monday, at least every week or two. And good way to start the week, I reckon. All right, so today's episode is exactly like I said in the intro, about flight tests. And there's a lot of anxiety about flight tests. They're horrible. Us flight examiners, we're terrible people, aren't we? Creating all this stress. But it doesn't need to be that stressful. There's always going to be an element of stress. I just did a flight test last week with CASA. And even I started getting a bit wound up and thinking about things and all that. I know exactly what it's like. And I never forget that when I'm with a student or an applicant, as you'll refer to, in a flight test. And getting those nerves under control. And one thing that goes a long way to helping control those nerves is A, knowing what the test is all about, what's going on, but B, obviously being well prepared. So that's what this is about. It's not going to be by any means a fully comprehensive tutorial exactly, but I just want to touch base on what's involved and how you can prepare yourself. Talk to your instructor who will prepare you appropriately, no doubt, but a lot of this is done at home and studying and preparing. So the RPL flight test, one of the first things we want to do is you don't need to guess. Now, when I do a flight test or any other examiner does a flight test, we're not just making stuff up. We are following a procedure, and that procedure effectively comes from the Flight Examiner Handbook. Now, you are most welcome to download the Flight Examiner Handbook. There's no secret codes or tricks or anything in there, but it does outline the format of the flight test. And I think it's important that you have a bit of a look at that because it makes no sense for you not to know what we're going to run through with you and the order it's done. Now, a lot of flight schools will do a pre-license flight test or flight check. It will emulate parts of the flight test if it's done properly, but a lot of schools I find are not doing that as much these days, and that then leaves you feeling a little bit bewildered and confused on the whole process. So hopefully schools are doing it properly and do a proper pre-license check. And the biggest difference with that is the differences in roles between a flight instructor and a flight examiner. Now, a flight instructor is obviously there to teach you, to help you, to guide you, and help along the way. Whereas as a flight examiner, our purpose is to assess and check that you are safe and capable of holding the qualification you are seeking, in this case, the RPL, the Restricted Pilot's License. The Recreational Pilot's License. So where this differs is we'll ask you to perform maneuvers and do various things and ask you questions, and we really just have to wait for you to answer the question or perform the maneuver by yourself. You can't ask us, how do I do this or how do I do that? And I don't know the answer to that one. All right, that's what the training and everything else up to this point is supposed to have covered off. So if you have a look in the Flight Examiner Handbook, Section 5 is the Recreational Pilot License aeroplane, and of course helicopters in there as well, but as we know, helicopters don't usually do RPL tests, but any flight test for anybody is in here. A lot of it in here is generic. You'll find it repeats itself in each flight test because there's not that much different, but it will take you through what's involved, the manual standards, tolerances and things that we need to, and we'll talk about that later in the flight component. All right, over and above this, then you want to make sure you download a copy of the RPL test form. Now again, anyone can access that. You can just simply get into Google or your favorite search engine and look for Form 61-1486, and that is the flight test report for the RPLA. Now, in there, you will see the ground component, and the ground component covers off the aeronautical knowledge, and all of this, again, is not made up. If you have a look in the third column under MOS, you'll see Schedule 5. Now, in the manual standards, which is where the Part 61 manual standards, where all the training competencies come from, all the units of knowledge and theory and the exams and everything, Schedule 5 is all the flight tests. And effectively, if you have a look in there, you'll see it looks exactly like the flight test form, just laid out a bit differently, but it's all the same information. That's where it comes from. All right, if you're interested, Schedule 6 covers off proficiency checks, and Schedule 7 covers off flight reviews. So if you have a flight review coming up, you can go there to see what that's all about as well. All right, so the ground component itself is here just to make sure that you understand the majority of elements that are going to form part of your function as the pilot in command as a RPL holder. All right, now we have to complete the ground component first. If you don't make the ground component and aren't competent, then the flight test will stop. All right, we don't sort of go flying and try and fix it later. It is a mandatory pass, I guess you could say. And with the flight test, you get 2 opportunities. So if you fail, you'll need to retest. But you've got 28 days from when you start a flight test to get it all done and finished. All right, and you get effectively 2 opportunities to pass the flying component if the first time it doesn't go so well. But like I said, we'll talk about that later. Now, the ground component is set up in 8 knowledge areas. You'll see A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H, and they should all be based on everything that you've been taught, studied and learnt throughout your RPL theory exam, your first solo, your training area solo, and all the lessons that have gone towards making up your flight training that you've done. So the first one, 2A, is the privileges of the license and the limitations of the license. And this should generally be answered in 2 different sections. So the privileges are that you can now be licensed and fly an aeroplane, single pilot in a certified single pilot aircraft, single engine, and fly around the area near your airport. The limitations is then where we roll in things like you have to stay within 25 nautical miles, you're not allowed to fly a rocket-powered or turbine-powered aircraft, a multi-engine aircraft, and you can't fly an airplane heavier than 1,500 kilos. There are some other answers, though, that might need to come up. And for the examiner to ask you these questions, it's impossible to ask all in one because there are so many elements to some of these topics, and therefore multiple questions may need to be asked. So it's not one question and then move on to the next. Part of this limitations and the privileges of the license is what kind of medical do you need? All right. Now, when we ask questions, some of them might be sort of point and shoot, if you like, and it's just a straightforward question with a straightforward answer. But the majority of the time, your examiner will use what's called scenario-based questions. And this is a different way of putting all the knowledge and theory into a more practical and usable way, the way air law comes up day to day. So, for example, you're going to go flying with your family today. What documents do you need to have on board with you to be able to go flying? All right, so you would then have to think about, well, I need my license, I need my medical, and that might be your answer to start with. And we go, okay, does it need to be a printed pilot license and medical? Or can you use one on your phone? All right, so again, we're just testing to see whether you actually understand the rules, the regs, and how they may pertain to what it is that you're doing at the time. So this is all extra underpinning knowledge, as we call it. And some questions may be sort of multi-layered. As to other documents like certificate of airworthiness and registration and all those sort of things, there's rules where when they must be on board the aircraft, and other times, which is the majority of the time the aircraft stays within the Australian territory, that they just need to be available in a filing cabinet somewhere. They don't necessarily have to be on board the airplane anymore. All right. What are some other limitations? How often do you need to go and do some circuits? How many takeoffs and landings do you need in the last 90 days? What if you did only 2 takeoffs and 3 landings because your instructor did 1? Does that count? All right. Usually things aren't going to get that tricky, but hey, it doesn't hurt to understand and think about these things. Because ultimately what's going to happen is you are now responsible for your own takeoffs and landings, your own currencies, your own knowledge. All right, the next one is the applicability of drug and alcohol regulations. So all aerodromes, all airports, all operators have a thing called a DAMP, or a drug and alcohol management plan. And within that plan, it does include you. When you're in the building or the premises, effectively draws you into that. And you can't be under the influence of alcohol or drugs whilst on the premises. And you are also susceptible to random CASA drug and alcohol tests should they happen to turn up on the premises on the day. Right? But that's the sort of extreme end of things. More likely, it's just simply going to be you're not feeling so good today. Should you go flying? What drugs can you take? Prescription or over-the-counter medications? Are there any limitations or considerations? You're not feeling very well and you've got a head cold and an earache. What are you going to do? All right. So again, very practical things that come up day to day. And the most common one, of course, is going to be you're having a bit of a party and you finish flying, or sort of finish drinking at 12 o'clock and you've got a flight at 8 o'clock. Can you go? And this is obviously leading towards the common 8-hour bottle to throttle sort of concept. But effectively, you need to have no alcohol in your system. There is an allowance of 0.02, but that is really for any residual alcohol that shouldn't be anything that's affecting your performance or function as a pilot, which includes flight planning, preparation, or anything else, not just the throttle part of going flying itself. All right, the next one on the list is VFR aircraft instrument requirements. So you should naturally know the mandatory instruments that are needed for going VFR flying, which isn't very many. Airspeed, altimeter, magnetic compass, a timepiece, your normal oil temperature pressure gauges and tachometer, fuel gauges and flap indicator, that sort of thing. But we're generally not going to ask you a question like that. We might say, you go into the aeroplane and set the local QNH and the altimeter reads 150 feet higher than the airfield elevation. Can you go flying? So this is a 2-part question. The first part is, well, do you need the altimeter to be working? So the answer is yes, it is a mandatory instrument. But it's not just does it need an altimeter, but what sensitivity or what tolerances must the altimeter be working in? And of course, a VFR altimeter needs to be within 100 feet. All right. So if you don't know that, that's part of that process. And again, this is not something that everyone's going to be reminding you of. That's just the rule that you need to remember. And if your altimeter's out of tolerances, it gets out of whack, then you need to let somebody know so it can get fixed and addressed and know whether you can still go flying or not. If your artificial horizon wasn't working properly, it was toppled, i.e. it was staying sort of on an angle and not straightening up properly, could you go flying? Well, yes. I don't need it to be working. All right, we don't need it as a mandatory VFR aircraft instrument, but in the aircraft, do we want one? Yeah, it's pretty handy, isn't it? And depends on the day, what we're doing. We might be doing some instrument flying or something else. So it's not very practical to not have it working. So again, that would effectively stop our flight. Doesn't necessarily ground the aeroplane. All right, I used to fly the Tiger Moth all the time. Didn't even have one installed. We didn't need it. All right, but you need to be practical in how we deal with these situations. Emergency equipment requirements. So what sort of equipment do we need on board the aeroplane? Now, this will be fairly limited, generally speaking, because as an RPL pilot, unless you do a navigation endorsement, and we'll talk about the add-ons in a minute, you're going to be restricted within 25 miles. So the odds of doing big over water legs or needing EPIRBs, designated remote areas, all that sort of stuff is going to be fairly limited. All right, but you may be an RPL holder in Broome, or in which case you are surrounded by a designated remote area. So these things can apply to you. So these questions will vary depending on your location and what's going to be most likely applicable to your area. All right, but things like knowing how an ELT or an EPIRB works, where it's located, life jacket use, when you need to wear them, again, that can be something that's applicable. Somewhere like Perth, flying to Rottnest all the time. Rottnest is within 25 miles. So you, as an RPL holder, you can fly there. In which case, you need to know how to work life jackets. All right, fuel planning. Again, not going to be doing big long legs unless you're doing navigation. Again, that will get covered in the navigation endorsement. However, if we're just going to go take some family or friends for a 1-hour flight, how much fuel do you need? So it's going to be a fairly basic question based on your typical aircraft's fuel flow. You need 1 hour's flight time, 30 minutes of final reserve fuel. However, your operation may increase that to 45 minutes of final reserve fuel. Usually that's based on holding fuel burn. So make sure you check that as to how that final reserve fuel is calculated. You're going to need around 5 litres or so of taxi fuel. And of course, if there happens to be any weather around inches or tempos, 30 or 60 minutes of weather holding fuel, you may need it. But again, you're not going to be going that far. So you'll typically find for VFR flying within 50 nautical miles that you don't need to carry that fuel because you can effectively see the weather coming and you're not going to get stuck, or at least that's the concept of it. IFR though, you still need to do it. All right, what sort of oil does your aircraft carry? What sort of fuel does it burn? How do you know? What colour should it be? How do you test for water? What do you do if you find it? All sorts of questions like that. Right, managing passengers and cargo. Again, just taking some family or friends for a fly. Obviously, your passenger brief is what's going to be really looked at here. What is required to be briefed? And again, you don't have to deliver it like a military general or anything. It can be fun but thorough, and make sure you cover everything, including the use of seatbelts and emergency exits, especially if you're in an aircraft where there's only one emergency exit, as in the main door on a low-wing aircraft. Often the right door is the entry, and that person has to get out of the way before you can get out. So there's some incentive to make sure that that's done properly. All right, cargo. Generally speaking, you're not going to be carrying any cargo, but things like high-wing aircraft that might have a little step ladder or something in the back, a little box of oil and other bits and pieces. That should all be strapped down, secured with a cargo net or something similar, so it can't fly around the back of the cockpit. All right, there's nothing worse than going to do a stalling lesson and not having that stuff tied down, and you push a bit too hard and it all goes flying up through the cockpit or through the back window. All right, then we get on to aircraft speed limitations. So the speed limitations are going to be based on your particular aircraft that you're using. The most common ones you're going to need to know are max angle and max rate, which is your VX and your VY, VA, which is your maneuvering speed, right? Your glide speed, and of course your typical power settings for the circuit and for cruise, and then your speeds for base and final, including if you're going to be doing a flapless landing or a short field performance takeoff and landing. So make sure you've got all those speeds noted and written down. The other aircraft systems section is then when we get into the fuel. How much fuel does your airplane hold? How much does it burn? I asked about oil earlier because that's sort of in the fuel planning and oil requirements. But how do you put oil into the airplane? What grade of oil do you need to use to make sure you get the right one? All right. Can you sign the aircraft maintenance release? Can you put things on the maintenance release? All right. So these are all questions that are very, very practical and very much to do with the kind of flying you're about to embark on. All right. As part of all this process, you are going to need to do a weight and balance and takeoff and landing chart again, and there'll be some questions associated with that. And that will pretty much cover the main parts of your RPL flight test. Now, as I mentioned, there are other flight endorsements or navigation endorsements that you can achieve which are not to do with the RPL flight test, however. All right, and in episode 188, I go through the RPL endorsements that are basically the controlled airspace, controlled aerodrome, navigation, and of course there's the flight radio operator license theory, and the license that allows you to talk on a radio. All right, and they are additional training endorsements. So they happen after your RPL flight test, and they are issued by a senior instructor in your flight school. They don't need to be retested. There are theory exams associated with the navigation endorsement, so it's not a cheat method of getting a PPL. It has applications, but typically speaking, most people are going to go ahead and get the private pilot's license because otherwise they're somewhat restricted in the kind of aircraft and flying that they may want to do. All right. So that's the ground component. Run through this, make notes, write down your references. Where do you find all this stuff? And the VFRG is generally the best sort of book to go through, but start looking at the CASRs and the manual standards, understand where these rules and regulations come from so that you know where to go and find things later on for your PPL, your CPL, your instrument rating, instructor rating, or anything else you do down the track. All right, we can't just go to that. And of course, you've also got the Part 91 Plain English Guide. We all know that air law is written for lawyers. It is horrible to the point where CASA have published a Plain English Guide, and there are more on their way for the various rules and regs to help you understand what's going on with that. And they are also able to be taken into theory exams as well. So that's a little bit of a bonus also. All right, so that's what we're looking for there. And as long as all that gets done, and I should have really mentioned just before that, even all your documents will be checked, your license, well, not your license yet because you haven't got one, but your medical, your logbook, your training records, all that sort of stuff, that'll all get double checked. Make sure you meet all the requirements. You will then get ready to go on the flight test. And that is what we're going to talk about next week, the RPL flight test. So there I'm going to take you through what's involved, what happens on the test, the tolerances that we're looking for, what will constitute a pass and a fail, and we'll have a bit of a chat about all that. All right, guys, so hopefully that is helpful and covered all that. If you have any questions, feel free to send them through. I will endeavour to cover them at the beginning of the episode next week before we get into it. But the biggest thing here is preparation is key, guys. I cannot stress that enough. Make sure that you are doing things yourself, not under the prompting of your instructor. Some instructors struggle to be quiet and back off and let you make mistakes or let you work through it yourself. Remember, the examiner is not going to be doing that. And that is the biggest fundamental difference between a training lesson and a flight test. It's very much show me a turn, pull the throttle, show me a forced landing, and you need to work through it and apply the relevant rules and procedures. But like I said, talk about all that next week. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for listening. As I said, please send through your questions, either about RPL or anything else. Send it through to me on email, info@trentrobinsonaviation.com.au. There you go. Anyway, that is in the show notes. All the links are there. You can follow me on Instagram, follow me on Facebook. Please leave a review on Spotify or the Apple Podcast app. Again, all your guys' interactions and feedback with the podcast absolutely helps me reach other aviators just like yourself and spread the good word. All right, until then, take care of yourselves, and I will see you next week where we'll keep talking more about RPL, flight test, and the flight component. Until then, blue skies, and remember the golden rule: aviate, navigate, communicate, including on the flight test. All right, cheers, guys.